Well, thank you so much for the time. Really, really appreciate it. It's an absolute honor to be speaking to you this afternoon as well here on Point. I just wanted to ask you perhaps if you could perhaps just share with us the parallels that are perhaps drawn now compared to 1976, 44 years ago, and perhaps whether things are sort of similar in the terms that we're still fighting for the freedom that we so richly would like.
Yeah, thank you very much, Baba, and good day to the viewers across the country. We live in interesting times, and first of all, I just want to pay tribute to a few gallant women fighters, because sometimes we give an impression that the struggle was only led by the men. In these days of gender-based violence, I want to single out to Sibongile Mkhabela or Gogu Mamtembu. Then I want to single out Joyce Dipale, Baby Chawa. Those are some of the women who were in the forefront of the movement, and they are still alive and they're still in the movement very much. So I also want to recognize Masabata Luwate and Nana Sabela. May their souls rest in peace. They were lost during the struggle. I just wanted to acknowledge them. When we want to draw parallels, and of course, each struggle does not wane, it doesn't grow old. It becomes the same struggle all over again, and it goes in periods. I think in my own assessment, we've seen the struggle go in generations of 20 years, 20 years, 20 years, something happens. And it's very interesting in this cycle, 44 years later, to see Black people still struggling, standing up to say, Black Lives Matter. And if you can look at what those kids in 1976 did, they were saying the same thing. Black Lives Matter. They were saying away with Africans, because Africans was intended to make them subservient to white Afrikanerdom. And they were saying that, no, my life as well matters. I want to be treated like everybody else. So there are very strong and striking parallels. Unfortunately, when one looks at the youth of today, and as it should for us as older people, we see some misdirection here and there. We see some lack of focus here and there. However, I think every now and then we keep getting called back to say, let's focus. Let's not lose sight of the fact that we are not yet 100% free. So we should fight as much as we can.
In fighting as much as we can right now, there's, as you said, the essence of trying to find the right mix, if you want to call it that, find the right, alleviate the misdirection, if we call it that as well. Then how do we ensure that the story of 44 years ago isn't necessarily lost, but is certainly moved forward, if we want to call it that, is grown, is enhanced to encourage a youth that right now may not necessarily know that story to its fullest, but certainly understand what it means that we are here right now and the ability to fight even more succinctly for the things we want today?
One of the things that Steve Biko spoke about passionately, and again, when we look at East Africa, in Tanzania, Julius Nyerere and that whole movement, was the whole question of self-determination. Among the other things that we're fighting for was, at the end of it all, a Black person has to have the right to determine their future and where they are. So I think one of the biggest challenges that the young people have today is to come out, to emerge, having defined themselves and having defined, first of all, their agenda, and secondly, where they want to go to and what they achieve and how they can achieve it. And when we talk about a whole mix of different instruments, that's when the challenges become bigger, because now you've got education, which supposedly is now open to everybody else. We've got opportunities which are supposedly open for everybody else. So young people today cannot afford to fail and then use apartheid as an excuse, because hypothetically, those shackles have been removed, hypothetically. So now they're supposed to compete on the same level with everybody else. Unfortunately, things like drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and just basically lack of focus and senselessness are coming into the way. And unfortunately, they seem to grab our young people more than the other societies that we can see from what is available to us. So the challenge to this self-determination is that young people need to understand that they need to participate in the economic emancipation. They need to do everything else, that they access the opportunities. I was just listening to the president's speech just before now, where he was saying that we as a country have to do everything to make sure that these young people are given opportunities. But then it doesn't end there, Gumede. Once they're given those opportunities, they need to go there and grab them with both hands. I don't see that resilience in today's youth. Young people way back when we were young, we tore down buildings to be given the opportunity. I see young people sitting back and wanting things to come to them. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's the mindset that we need to change in order for things to get to where they're supposed to get.
A journalist then 44 years ago, in a time where you needed to report on the truth and perhaps were struggling to perhaps tell the truth, as it were, because of the pressures that you faced. Do you feel that, even that industry perhaps has altered, has changed, has perhaps not remained as resilient as it could have been?
Journalists were fighters. We created an organization called the Union of Black Journalists, UBJ, with people like Moffat Zongo, with people like Peter Makubane, with people like Joe Trolwe, with all the journalists that you used to read about, who used to get arrested and stuff like that. Journalists were fighters. Abutami Mazwai. I mean, all those names were people who were fighting against the system as well. Today, journalism seems to have been demoted to some yellow journalism, where journalists think being a journalist is to try and bring black people down, to go and snoop into their bedrooms and see who's sleeping with who. Maybe those things are important to certain people, but we no longer see the kind of journalism that propped us up. We got arrested. I spent the rest of the year in jail, in detention, together with about 15 other journalists, where our only crime was the fact that we were journalists and we were reporting on the truth. Today, I don't see, again, that resilience. And I think we need a new wave of young people that can research, that can do investigative journalism, that can fight, whether they fight corruption or they fight oppression or they fight racism, but they need to have an ideal to fight for. We can't have newspapers reporting on gossip every day and becoming the bigger thing is. They can do that in some small corner of the page, but we do need young people who are inspired, who are driven to change society for the better. And I don't see that today.
I don't see your message perhaps then to not just the youth of today, but really just, I suppose, to a country that continues to struggle, a country that still fights on, and the rest of the world, I suppose, where the issue of Black Lives Matter still is hovering amidst all of us.
For those of us who are veterans, or called veterans or legends, now what is becoming even more clearer is that as Black people, we still need an agenda. We need to articulate our own agenda and find out what it is that we want. It just cannot be business as usual. When the president moved us from level 4 to level 3, I saw people with marching bands going to liquor stores to go and celebrate the opening of the liquor. We don't see that kind of excitement in people freeing themselves. We have young people who are still being killed. We have young women who are being killed by their boyfriends and spouses. We don't see that energy by our young brothers to fight that scourge, but we see an energy to get happy to be intoxicated. So I think the message is that we need to articulate an agenda. We need to all know what we want to achieve and go out there ferociously and try and achieve those things. And lastly, I just want to say that as a country, we need to bring Mbuyisa Makubu back home. Most of us are convinced that the man in Canada who languished in a Canadian jail for more than 10 years is Mbuyisa Makubu. He was positively identified. The Department of Arts and Culture sent out all kinds of protocols to find out who he is. And I think as a country, we owe it to him to bring him back home and celebrate him.
Duma Ka Ndlovu, thank you so much. I certainly take your message to heart and feel even more invigorated to certainly be even better, not just in my task and my job as a journalist, but certainly as a young South African citizen as well. Thank you so much for your fight and your continued inspiration there. Duma Ka Ndlovu was a journalist right back then in 1976, honoring, telling the story, and certainly giving vigor to the youth of today then as well.